Opposition built, and a coup was launched in 1965. Sukarno escaped assassination only through the quick wits of his mistress. Many of his top military officers and his closest associates were less lucky. The events were reminiscent of those in Iran in 1953. In the end, the Communist Party was held responsible, especially those factions aligned with China. In the army-initiated massacres that followed, an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 people were killed. The head of the military, General Suharto, took over as president in 1968. By 1971, the United States' determination to seduce Indonesia away from communism was heightened because the outcome of the Vietnam War was looking very uncertain. President Nixon had begun a series of troop withdrawals in the summer of 1969, and U.S. strategy was taking on a more global perspective. The strategy focused on preventing a domino effect of one country after another falling under communist rule, and it focused on a couple of countries. Indonesia was the key. Maine's electrification project was part of a comprehensive plan to ensure American dominance in Southeast Asia. The premise of U.S. foreign policy was that Suharto would serve Washington in a manner similar to the Shah of Iran. The United States also hoped the nation would serve as a model for other countries in the region. Washington based part of its strategy on the assumption that gains made in Indonesia might have positive repercussions throughout the Islamic world, particularly in the explosive Middle East. And if that were not incentive enough, Indonesia had oil. No one was certain about the magnitude or quality of its reserves, but oil company seismologists were exuberant over the possibilities. As I pored over the books at the BPL, my excitement grew. I began to imagine the adventures ahead. In working for Maine, I would be trading the rugged Peace Corps lifestyle for a much more luxurious and glamorous one. My time with Claudine already represented the realization of one of my fantasies. It seemed too good to be true. I felt at least partially vindicated for serving the sentence at that all-boys prep school. Something else was also happening in my life. Anne and I were not getting along. I think she must have sensed that I was leading two lives. I justified it as the logical result of the resentment I felt toward her for forcing us to get married in the first place. Never mind that she had nurtured and supported me through the challenges of our Peace Corps assignment in Ecuador. I still saw her as a continuation of my pattern of giving in to my parents' whims. Of course, as I look back on it, I'm sure my relationship with Claudine was a major factor. I could not tell Anne about this, but she sensed it. In any case, we decided to move into separate apartments. One day in 1971, about a week before my scheduled departure for Indonesia, I arrived at Claudine's place to find the small dining room table set with an assortment of cheeses and breads, and there was a fine bottle of Beaujolais. She toasted me. "You've made it." She smiled, but somehow it seemed less than sincere. "You're now one of us." We chatted casually for half an hour or so. Then, as we were finishing off the wine, she gave me a look unlike any I had seen before. "Never admit to anyone about our meetings," she said in a stern voice. "I won't forgive you if you do, ever, and I'll deny I ever met you." She glared at me, perhaps the only time I felt threatened by her, and then gave a cold laugh. "Talking about us would make life dangerous for you." I was stunned. I felt terrible. But later, as I walked alone back to the Prudential Center, I had to admit to the cleverness of the scheme. The fact is that all our time together had been spent in her apartment. There was not a trace of evidence about our relationship, and no one at Maine was implicated in any way. There was also part of me that appreciated her honesty. She had not deceived me the way my parents had about Tilton and Middlebury. Chapter 4. Saving a Country from Communism. I had a romanticized vision of Indonesia, the country where I was to live for the next 3 months. Some of the books I read featured photographs of beautiful women in brightly colored sarongs, exotic Balinese dancers, shamans blowing fire, and warriors paddling long dugout canoes in emerald waters at the foot of smoking volcanoes. Particularly striking was a series on the magnificent black-sailed galleons of the infamous Boogie pirates, who still sailed the seas of the archipelago, and who had so terrorized early European sailors that they returned home to warn their children, "Behave yourselves, or the boogeymen will get you." Oh, how those pictures stirred my soul. The history and legends of that country represent a cornucopia of larger-than-life figures, wrathful gods, Komodo dragons, tribal sultans, and ancient tales that long before the birth of Christ had traveled across Asian mountains, through Persian deserts, and over the Mediterranean to embed themselves in the deepest realms of our collective psyche. The very names of its fabled islands, Java, Sumatra, Borneo, Sulawesi, seduced the mind. Here was a land of mysticism, myth, and erotic beauty, an elusive treasure sought but never found by Columbus, a princess wooed yet never possessed by Spain, by Holland, by Portugal, by Japan, a fantasy and a dream. My expectations were high, and I suppose they mirrored those of the great explorers. Like Columbus, though, I should have known to temper my fantasies. Perhaps I could have guessed that the beacon shines on a destiny that is not always the one we envision. Indonesia offered treasures, but it was not the chest of panaceas I had come to expect. In fact, my first days in Indonesia's steamy capital, Jakarta, in the summer of 1971, were shocking. The beauty was certainly present. Gorgeous women sporting colorful sarongs, lush gardens ablaze with tropical flowers, exotic Balinese dancers, bicycle cabs with fanciful rainbow-colored scenes painted on the sides of the high seats, where passengers reclined in front of the pedaling drivers, Dutch colonial mansions and turreted mosques. But there was also an ugly, tragic side to the city. Lepers holding out bloodied stumps instead of hands, young girls offering their bodies for a few coins, once splendid Dutch canals turned into cesspools, cardboard hovels where entire families lived along the trash-lined banks of black rivers, blaring horns and choking fumes. The beautiful and the ugly, the elegant and the vulgar, the spiritual and the profane. This was Jakarta, where the enticing scent of cloves and orchid blossoms battled the miasma of open sewers for dominance. I had seen poverty before. Some of my New Hampshire classmates lived in cold-water tar-paper shacks and arrived at school wearing thin jackets and frayed tennis shoes on sub-zero winter days, their unwashed bodies reeking of old sweat and manure. I had lived in mud shacks with Andean peasants whose diet consisted almost entirely of dried corn and potatoes, and where it sometimes seemed that a newborn was as likely to die as to experience a birthday. I had seen poverty, but nothing to prepare me for Jakarta. Our team, of course, was quartered in the country's fanciest hotel, the Hotel Intercontinental Indonesia, owned by Pan American Airways. Like the rest of the intercontinental chain scattered across the globe, it catered to the whims of wealthy foreigners, especially oil executives and their families. On the evening of our first day, our project manager, Charlie Illingworth, hosted a dinner for us in the elegant restaurant on the top floor. Charlie was a connoisseur of war. He devoted most of his free time to reading history books and historical novels about great military leaders and battles. He was the epitome of the pro-Vietnam War armchair soldier. As usual, this night he was wearing khaki slacks and a short-sleeved khaki shirt with military-style epaulets. After welcoming us, he lit up a cigar. "To the good life," he sighed, raising a glass of champagne. We joined him. To the good life. Our glasses clinked. Cigar smoke swirling around him, Charlie glanced about the room. "We will be well pampered here," he said, nodding his head appreciatively. "The Indonesians will take very good care of us, as will the U.S. Embassy people, but let's not forget that we have a mission to accomplish." He looked down at a handful of note cards. "Yes, we're here to develop a master plan for the electrification of Java, the most populated land in the world. But that's just the tip of the iceberg." His expression turned serious. He reminded me of George C. Scott playing General Patton, one of Charlie's heroes. "We are here to accomplish nothing short of saving this country from the clutches of communism. As you know, Indonesia has a long and tragic history. Now, at a time when it is poised to launch itself into the 20th century, it is tested once again. Our responsibility is to make sure that Indonesia doesn't follow in the footsteps of its northern neighbors, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. An integrated electrical system is a key element. That, more than any other single factor, with the possible exception of oil, will assure that capitalism and democracy rule." "Speaking of oil," he said. He took another puff on his cigar and flipped past a couple of the note cards. "We all know how dependent our own country is on oil. Indonesia can be a powerful ally to us in that regard. So as you develop this master plan, please do everything you can to make sure that the oil industry and all the others that serve it, ports, pipelines, construction companies, get whatever they are likely to need in the way of electricity for the entire duration of this 25-year plan." He raised his eyes from his note cards and looked directly at me. "Better to err on the high side than to underestimate. You don't want the blood of Indonesian children, or our own, on your hands. You don't want them to live under the hammer and sickle or the red flag of China." As I lay in my bed that night, high above the city, secure in the luxury of a first-class suite, an image of Claudine came to me. Her discourses on foreign debt haunted me. I tried to comfort myself by recalling lessons learned in my macroeconomics courses at business school. After all, I told myself, I am here to help Indonesia rise out of a medieval economy and take its place in the modern industrial world. But I knew that in the morning I would look out my window across the opulence of the hotels, gardens, and swimming pools, and see the hovels that fanned out for miles beyond. I would know that babies were dying out there for lack of food and potable water, and that infants and adults alike were suffering from horrible diseases and living in terrible conditions. Tossing and turning in my bed, I found it impossible to deny that Charlie and everyone else on our team were here for selfish reasons. We were promoting U.S. foreign policy and corporate interests. We were driven by greed, rather than by any desire to make life better for the vast majority of Indonesians. A word came to mind: corporatocracy. I was not sure whether I had heard it before or had just invented it, but it seemed to describe perfectly the new elite who had made up their minds to attempt to rule the planet. This was a close-knit fraternity of a few men with shared goals, and the fraternity's members moved easily and often between corporate boards and government positions. It struck me that the current president of the World Bank, Robert McNamara, was a perfect example. He had moved from a position as president of Ford Motor Company to Secretary of Defense under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, and now occupied the top post at the world's most powerful financial institution. I also realized that my college professors had not understood the true nature of macroeconomics, that in many cases, helping an economy grow only makes those few people who sit atop the pyramid even richer, while it does nothing for those at the bottom except to push them even lower. Indeed, promoting capitalism often results in a system that resembles medieval feudal societies. If any of my professors knew this, they had not admitted it, probably because big corporations, and the men who run them, fund colleges. Exposing the truth would undoubtedly cost those professors their jobs, just as such revelations could cost me mine. These thoughts continued to disturb my sleep every night that I spent at the Hotel Intercontinental Indonesia. In the end, my primary defense was a highly personal one. I had fought my way out of that New Hampshire town, the prep school, and the draft. Through a combination of coincidences and hard work, I had earned a place in the good life. I also took comfort in the fact that I was doing the right thing in the eyes of my culture. I was on my way to becoming a successful and respected economist. I was doing what business school had prepared me for. I was helping implement a development model that was sanctioned by the best minds at the world's top think tanks. Nonetheless, in the middle of the night, I often had to console myself with a promise that someday I would expose the truth. Then I would read myself to sleep with Louis L'Amour novels about gunfighters in the Old West. Chapter 5. Selling My Soul. Our 11-man team spent 6 days in Jakarta, registering at the U.S. Embassy, meeting various officials, organizing ourselves, and relaxing around the pool. The number of Americans who lived at the Hotel Intercontinental amazed me. I took great pleasure in watching the beautiful young women, wives of U.S. oil and construction company executives, who passed their days at the pool and their evenings in the half-dozen posh restaurants in and around the hotel. Then Charlie moved our team to the mountain city of Bandung. The climate was milder, the poverty less obvious, and the distractions fewer. We were given a government guest house known as the Wisma, complete with a manager, a cook, a gardener, and a staff of servants. Built during the Dutch colonial period, the Wisma was a haven. Its spacious veranda faced tea plantations that flowed across rolling hills and up the slopes of Java's volcanic mountains. In addition to housing, we were provided with 11 Toyota off-road vehicles, each with a driver and translator. Finally, we were presented with memberships to the exclusive Bandung Golf and Racquet Club, and we were housed in a suite of offices at the local headquarters of Perusahaan Umum Listrik Negara, PLN, the government-owned electric utility company. For me, the first several days in Bandung involved a series of meetings with Charlie and Howard Parker. Howard was in his 70s and was the retired chief load forecaster for the New England electric system. Now he was responsible for forecasting the amount of energy and generating capacity, the load, the island of Java would need over the next 25 years, as well as for breaking this down into city and regional forecasts. Since electric demand is highly correlated with economic growth, his forecasts depended on my economic projections. The rest of our team would develop the master plan around these forecasts, locating and designing power plants, transmission and distribution lines, and fuel transportation systems in a manner that would satisfy our projections as efficiently as possible. During our meetings, Charlie continually emphasized the importance of my job, and he badgered me about the need to be very optimistic in my forecasts. Claudine had been right. I was the key to the entire master plan. The first few weeks here, Charlie explained, are about data collection. He, Howard, and I were seated in big rattan chairs in Charlie's plush private office. The walls were decorated with batik tapestries, depicting epic tales from the ancient Hindu texts of the Ramayana. Charlie puffed on a fat cigar. The engineers will put together a detailed picture of the current electric system, port capacities, roads, railroads, all those sorts of things. He pointed his cigar at me. You gotta act fast. By the end of month 1, Howard'll need to get a pretty good idea about the full extent of the economic miracles that'll happen when we get the new grid online. By the end of the second month, he'll need more details, broken down into regions. The last month will be about filling in the gaps. That'll be critical. All of us will put our heads together then. So, before we leave, we gotta be absolutely certain we have all the information we'll need. Home for Thanksgiving, that's my motto. There's no coming back. Howard appeared to be an amiable, grandfatherly type, but he was actually a bitter old man who felt cheated by life. He had never reached the pinnacle of the New England electric system, and he deeply resented it. "Passed over," he told me repeatedly, "because I refused to buy the company line." He had been forced into retirement, and then, unable to tolerate staying at home with his wife, had accepted a consulting job with Maine. This was his second assignment, and I had been warned by both Einar and Charlie to watch out for him. They described him with words like stubborn, mean, and vindictive. As it turned out, Howard was one of my wisest teachers, although not one I was ready to accept at the time. He had never received the type of training Claudine had given me. I suppose they considered him too old, or perhaps too stubborn, or maybe they figured he was only in it for the short run, until they could lure in a more pliable full-timer like me. In any case, from their standpoint, he turned out to be a problem. Howard clearly saw the situation and the role they wanted him to play, and he was determined not to be a pawn. All the adjectives Einar and Charlie had used to describe him were appropriate, but at least some of his stubbornness grew out of his personal commitment not to be their servant. I doubt he had ever heard the term economic hitman, but he knew they intended to use him to promote a form of imperialism he could not accept. He took me aside after one of our meetings with Charlie. He wore a hearing aid and fiddled with the little box under his shirt that controlled its volume. "This is between you and me," Howard said in a hushed voice. We were standing at the window in the office we shared, looking out at the stagnant canal that wound past the PLN building. A young woman was bathing in its foul waters, attempting to retain some semblance of modesty by loosely draping a sarong around her otherwise naked body. "They'll try to convince you that this economy is going to skyrocket," he said. "Charlie's ruthless. Don't let him get to you." His words gave me a sinking feeling, but also a desire to convince him that Charlie was right. After all, my career depended on pleasing my main bosses. "Surely this economy will boom," I said, my eyes drawn to the woman in the canal. "Just look at what's happening." "So there you are," he muttered, apparently unaware of the scene in front of us. "You've already bought their line, have you?" A movement up the canal caught my attention. An elderly man had descended the bank, dropped his pants, and squatted at the edge of the water to answer nature's call. The young woman saw him, but was undeterred. She continued bathing. I turned away from the window and looked directly at Howard. "I've been around," I said. "I may be young, but I just got back from 3 years in South America. I've seen what can happen when oil is discovered. Things change fast." "Oh, I've been around too," he said mockingly. "A great many years. I'll tell you something, young man. I don't give a damn for your oil discoveries and all that. I forecasted electric loads all my life, during the Depression, World War II, times of bust and boom. I've seen what Route 128's so-called Massachusetts Miracle did for Boston, and I can say for sure that no electric load ever grew by more than 7 to 9% a year for any sustained period, and that's in the best of times. 6% is more reasonable." I stared at him. Part of me suspected he was right, but I felt defensive. I knew I had to convince him, because my own conscience cried out for justification. "Howard, this isn't Boston. This is a country where, until now, no one could even get electricity. Things are different here." He turned on his heel and waved his hand as though he could brush me away. "Go ahead," he snarled. "Sell out. I don't give a damn what you come up with." He jerked his chair from behind his desk and fell into it. "I'll make my electricity forecast based on what I believe, not some pie-in-the-sky economic study." He picked up his pencil and started to scribble on a pad of paper. It was a challenge I could not ignore. I went and stood in front of his desk. "You'll look pretty stupid if I come up with what everyone expects, a boom to rival the California gold rush, and you forecast electricity growth at a rate comparable to Boston in the 1960s. He slammed the pencil down and glared at me. "Unconscionable! That's what it is, you! All of you!" He waved his arms at the offices beyond our walls. "You've sold your souls to the devil. You're in it for the money. Now," he feigned a smile and reached under his shirt, "I'm turning off my hearing aid and going back to work." It shook me to the core. I stomped out of the room and headed for Charlie's office. Halfway there, I stopped, uncertain about what I intended to accomplish. Instead, I turned and walked down the stairs, out the door, into the afternoon sunlight. The young woman was climbing out of the canal, her sarong wrapped tightly about her body. The elderly man had disappeared. Several boys played in the canal, splashing and shouting at each other. An older woman was standing knee-deep in the water, brushing her teeth. Another was scrubbing clothes. A huge lump grew in my throat. I sat down on a slab of broken concrete, trying to disregard the pungent odor from the canal. I fought hard to hold back the tears. I needed to figure out why I felt so miserable. "You're in it for the money." I heard Howard's words over and over. He had struck a raw nerve. The little boys continued to splash each other, their gleeful voices filling the air. I wondered what I could do. What would it take to make me carefree like them? The question tormented me as I sat there watching them cavort in their blissful innocence, apparently unaware of the risk they took by playing in that fetid water. An elderly, hunchbacked man with a gnarled cane hobbled along the bank above the canal. He stopped and watched the boys, and his face broke into a toothless grin. Perhaps I could confide in Howard. Maybe together we would arrive at a solution. I immediately felt a sense of relief. I picked up a little stone and threw it into the canal. As the ripples faded, however, so did my euphoria. I knew I could do no such thing. Howard was old and bitter. He had already passed up opportunities to advance his own career. Surely he would not buckle now. I was young, just starting out, and certainly did not want to end up like him. Staring into the water of that putrid canal, I once again saw images of the New Hampshire prep school on the hill, where I had spent vacations alone, while the other boys went off to their debutante balls. Slowly, the sorry fact settled in. Once again, there was no one I could talk to. That night I lay in bed, thinking for a long time about the people in my life. Howard, Charlie, Claudine, Anne, Einar, Uncle Frank. Wondering what my life would be like if I had never met them. Where would I be living? Not Indonesia, that was for sure. I wondered also about my future, about where I was headed. I pondered the decision confronting me. Charlie had made it clear that he expected Howard and me to come up with growth rates of at least 17% per annum. What kind of forecast would I produce? Suddenly, a thought came to me that soothed my soul. Why had it not occurred to me before? The decision was not mine at all. Howard had said that he would do what he considered right, regardless of my conclusions. I could please my bosses with a high economic forecast, and he would make his own decision. My work would have no effect on the master plan. People kept emphasizing the importance of my role, but they were wrong. A great burden had been lifted. I fell into a deep sleep. A few days later, Howard was taken ill with a severe amoebic attack. We rushed him to a Catholic missionary hospital. The doctors prescribed medication and strongly recommended that he return immediately to the United States. Howard assured us that he already had all the data he needed, and could easily complete the load forecast from Boston. His parting words to me were a reiteration of his earlier warning. "No need to cook the numbers," he said. "I'll not be part of that scam, no matter what you say about the miracles of economic growth." Part 2, 1971 to 1975. Chapter 6. My Role as Inquisitor. Our contracts with the Indonesian government, the Asian Development Bank, and U.S. aid required that someone on our team visit all the major population centers in the area covered by the master plan. I was designated to fulfill this condition. As Charlie put it, "You survived the Amazon. You know how to handle bugs, snakes, and bad water." Along with a driver and translator, I visited many beautiful places and stayed in some pretty dismal lodgings. I met with local business and political leaders and listened to their opinions about the prospects for economic growth. However, I found most of them reluctant to share information with me. They seemed intimidated by my presence. Typically, they told me that I would have to check with their bosses, with government agencies, or with corporate headquarters in Jakarta. I sometimes suspected some sort of conspiracy was directed at me. These trips were usually short, not more than 2 or 3 days. In between, I returned to the Wisma in Bandung. The woman who managed it had a son a few years younger than me. His name was Razman, but to everyone except his mother, he was Razzie. A student of economics at a local university, he immediately took an interest in my work. In fact, I suspected that at some point he would approach me for a job. He also began to teach me Bahasa Indonesia. Creating an easy-to-learn language had been President Sukarno's highest priority after Indonesia won its independence from Holland. Over 350 languages and dialects are spoken throughout the archipelago, and Sukarno realized that his country needed a common vocabulary in order to unite people from the many islands and cultures. He recruited an international team of linguists, and Bahasa Indonesia was the highly successful result. Based on Malay, it avoids many of the tense changes, irregular verbs, and other complications that characterize most languages. By the early 1970s, the majority of Indonesians spoke it, although they continued to rely on Javanese and other local dialects within their own communities. Razzie was a great teacher with a wonderful sense of humor, and compared to learning Shuar or even Spanish, Bahasa was easy. Razzie owned a motor scooter and took it upon himself to introduce me to his city and people. "I'll show you a side of Indonesia you haven't seen," he promised one evening, and urged me to hop on behind him. We passed shadow puppet shows, musicians playing traditional instruments, fire-blowers, jugglers, and street vendors selling every imaginable ware, from contraband American cassettes to rare indigenous artifacts. Finally, we ended up at a tiny coffee house, populated by young men and women whose clothes, hats, and hairstyles would have been right in fashion at a Beatles concert in the late 1960s. However, every one was distinctly Indonesian. Razzie introduced me to a group seated around a table, and we sat down. They all spoke English, with varying degrees of fluency, but they appreciated and encouraged my attempts at Bahasa. They talked about this openly, and asked me why Americans never learned their language. I had no answer, nor could I explain why I was the only American or European in this part of the city, even though you could always find plenty of us at the golf and racket club, the posh restaurants, the movie theaters, and the upscale supermarkets. It was a night I shall always remember. Razzie and his friends treated me as one of their own. I enjoyed a sense of euphoria from being there, sharing their city, food, and music, smelling the clove cigarettes and other aromas that were part of their lives, joking and laughing with them. It was like the Peace Corps all over again, and I found myself wondering why I had thought that I wanted to travel first class and separate myself from people like this. As the night wore on, They became increasingly interested in learning my thoughts about their country, and about the war my country was fighting in Vietnam. Every one of them was horrified by what they referred to as the illegal invasion, and they were relieved to discover I shared their feelings. By the time Razzie and I returned to the guest house, it was late, and the place was dark. I thanked him profusely for inviting me into his world. He thanked me for opening up to his friends. We promised to do it again, hugged, and headed off to our respective rooms. That experience with Razzie whetted my appetite for spending more time away from the main team. The next morning, I had a meeting with Charlie and told him I was becoming frustrated trying to obtain information from local people. In addition, most of the statistics I needed for developing economic forecasts could only be found at government offices in Jakarta. Charlie and I agreed that I would need to spend 1 to 2 weeks in Jakarta. He expressed sympathy for me having to abandon Bandung for the steaming metropolis, and I professed to detest the idea. Secretly, however, I was excited by the opportunity to have some time to myself, to explore Jakarta, and to live at the elegant Hotel Intercontinental Indonesia. Once in Jakarta, however, I discovered that I now viewed life from a different perspective. The night spent with Razzie and the young Indonesians, as well as my travels around the country, had changed me. I found that I saw my fellow Americans in a different light. Their young wives seemed not quite so beautiful. The chain-link fence around the pool and the steel bars outside the windows on the lower floors, which I had barely noticed before, now took on an ominous appearance. The food in the hotel's elegant restaurants seemed insipid. I noticed something else, too. During my meetings with political and business leaders, I became aware of subtleties in the way they treated me. I had not perceived it before, but now I saw that many of them resented my presence. For example, when they introduced me to each other, they often used Bahasa terms that, according to my dictionary, translated to inquisitor and interrogator. I purposely neglected disclosing my knowledge of their language. Even my translator knew only that I could recite a few stock phrases. And I purchased a good Bahasa English dictionary, which I often used after leaving them. Were these addresses just coincidences of language? Misinterpretations in my dictionary? I tried to convince myself they were. Yet the more time I spent with these men, the more convinced I became that I was an intruder, that an order to cooperate had come down from someone, and that they had little choice but to comply. I had no idea whether a government official, a banker, a general, or the U.S. Embassy had sent the order. All I knew was that although they invited me into their offices, offered me tea, politely answered my questions, and in every overt manner seemed to welcome my presence, beneath the surface there was a shadow of resignation and rancor. It made me wonder, too, about their answers to my questions, and about the validity of their data. For instance, I could never just walk into an office with my translator and meet with someone. We first had to set up an appointment. In itself, this would not have seemed so strange, except that doing so was outrageously time-consuming. Since the phones seldom worked, we had to drive through the traffic-choked streets, which were laid out in such a contorted manner that it could take an hour to reach a building only blocks away. Once there, we were asked to fill out several forms. Eventually, a male secretary would appear. Politely, always with the courteous smile for which the Javanese are famous, he would question me about the types of information I desired, and then he would establish a time for the meeting. Without exception, the scheduled appointment was at least several days away, and when the meeting finally occurred, I was handed a folder of prepared materials. The industry owners gave me 5- and 10-year plans. The bankers had charts and graphs, and the government officials provided lists of projects that were in the process of leaving the drawing boards to become engines of economic growth. Everything these captains of commerce and government provided, and all they said during the interviews, indicated that Java was poised for perhaps the biggest boom any economy had ever enjoyed. No one, not a single person, ever questioned this premise or gave me any negative information. As I headed back to Bandung, though, I found myself wondering about all these experiences. Something was deeply disturbing. It occurred to me that everything I was doing in Indonesia was more like a game than reality. It was as though we were playing a game of poker. We kept our cards hidden. We could not trust each other or count on the reliability of the information we shared. Yet, this game was deadly serious, and its outcome would impact millions of lives for decades to come.